They said the Department of Anomalous Research never existed. Officially, it was dissolved in 1969, a short-lived branch of the Defense Analysis Bureau that studied psychological irregularities in field agents. Nothing unusual there, until the name of one internal project began reappearing in declassified fragments. Project Icarus. On paper, it was a behavioral study involving sensory deprivation and dream analysis. But one man, investigative journalist Elias Rowe, discovered something that didn't fit the bureaucratic tone of the remaining documents. Amid dry research memos and medical summaries were phrases that read like something out of folklore. Resonant sigil exposure, ritual coherence response, subject experienced entity echo. Rowe stumbled on the first clue while researching a different story, a profile on Cold War psychological warfare. A retired technician now living in coastal Maine mentioned the Dream Lab. When Rowe pressed, the old man froze, eyes distant, then whispered, "They said it was science, but it wasn't." The technician handed him a crumbling envelope before asking him to leave. Inside were 2 pages stamped Top Secret Division Icarus, both covered in water stains and a single line of handwritten instruction. Read, forget. That night, Rose sat in his small apartment, the only light coming from his desk lamp. He spread the papers flat. The text was fragmented, but one phrase stood out like a scar. Objective, determine the threshold at which belief manifests observable phenomena. He read it again. Oh, and again. It wasn't about drugs or hypnosis. It was about belief itself and how it could be weaponized. Outside, a storm rolled in, and as thunder rattled the glass, Rowe noticed something else scribbled in pencil along the margin. They opened something that looked back. Elias Rowe couldn't sleep that night. The words from the file pulsed in his mind, belief manifests observable phenomena. He'd covered classified programs before, Cold War brainwave mapping, hypnosis trials, even sleep deprivation endurance tests, but this was different. This wasn't about breaking bodies, it was about shaping reality itself. The next morning, he began tracing signatures on the documents. The name Dr. Mara Venn, chief researcher for Division Icarus, appeared repeatedly. Public records showed she'd been a cognitive linguist at Whitfield University before vanishing in 1970. Official cause, relocation overseas. No one knew where. Rowe visited Whitfield's shuttered psychology building, a red brick labyrinth at the edge of campus, condemned and silent. A janitor, noticing his press badge, hesitated before saying, "You're not the first to ask about her. They cleaned out her lab overnight, no notice, just trucks." In the abandoned lab, dust coated everything like frost. On the wall beneath peeling paint, faint chalk diagrams remained, concentric circles filled with symbols, not letters, not numbers. They resembled planetary orbits drawn by someone trying to measure emotion. Then Rowe found something that shouldn't have survived. A reel-to-reel tape labeled Icarus Field Log 4B. The recording, brittle with age, began with Dr. Venn's calm voice. Subject 12 reports full synchronization after exposure to the chant pattern. Elevated heart rate, pupil dilation, audio interference detected, repeating sequence. A pause, then a sound not human, not mechanical, like static bending inward. Venn's voice returned, sharper now. In the session, the mirror is active. Then silence. Rowe replayed that phrase, "the mirror is active," over and over. He didn't know it yet, but that sentence would define the next 6 months of his life. Rowe spent the following week buried in archives, piecing together the faint echoes of Project Icarus. Every lead circled back to the same phrase from Venn's tape, "The mirror is active." It wasn't metaphorical. It referred to something precise, an experiment housed at Site 22, a subterranean facility in the Nevada desert. The few records that survived painted a picture both clinical and deranged. Protocol objective: examine the reflective threshold of consciousness. Establish if emotional projection can alter measurable field conditions. Translated: they were trying to see if the human mind could affect the physical world when pushed through ritual and belief systems. Rowe tracked down Dr. Benjamin Cade, a systems analyst who'd worked under Venn. Cade was 82, soft-spoken, and lived in a hospice on the edge of Santa Fe. When Rowe mentioned mirror protocol, the old man's expression froze, a mask of something between fear and reverence. It wasn't a mirror, Cade whispered. It was a containment frame, polished obsidian, 2 meters tall. It didn't reflect, it absorbed. We thought it was measuring electromagnetic feedback, but it was reacting to us. He looked at Rowe, eyes watering. We didn't open a door, Mr. Rowe. We built one. Rowe pressed for details, but Cade's nurse interrupted, ending the conversation. Hours later, when Rowe returned, the old man was gone, stroke in his sleep, the staff said. Back in his motel, Rowe re-listened to Venn's tape. At 2 minutes 17 seconds, faint beneath the static, another voice emerged, male, strained. She's seeing herself in the frame. Pull her out, pull her. Then a snap of distortion. Rowe leaned back, pulse hammering. If what Cade implied was true, Project Icarus hadn't been shut down for failure. It had been contained. 2 weeks later, Elias Rowe found himself driving across the Nevada desert with a thermos of burnt coffee and a single map coordinate scrawled on the back of a library printout. It had come from an anonymous email with no sender's name, just the subject line, "UMBRA looking for Site 22. The GPS signal vanished miles before the turnoff. The road narrowed to cracked asphalt, then dirt, then silence. At sunset he saw it, a half-buried concrete structure jutting from the sand like a fossil, its entrance sealed by a rusted blast door. The air shimmered with heat. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled though the sky was clear. He pried the door open with a crowbar, metal screaming as it gave way. The stench hit first dust, oil, and something chemical. The facility stretched downward in long, windowless corridors lined with peeling signage. Icarus/Division 3 Perception Labs. His flashlight flickered across rooms left frozen in time. Desks overturned, typewriters half-smashed, reels of magnetic tape melted to their spools. In one observation chamber, the word "forget" had been painted across the glass in some kind of resin. Then came the chamber that stopped him cold. At its center stood a tall frame, black, gleaming even in the dim light. Obsidian, just like Cade described. Its surface swallowed the beam from Rowe's flashlight. There was no reflection, only depth, like staring into smoke suspended in stone. He whispered to himself, "The mirror is active." The words left his mouth and instantly echoed, but not from the walls. It was inside his head, clear as thought, repeating in a voice that wasn't his own. He stumbled back, heart racing. A chill spread through the air, and for the briefest second the surface rippled. His reflection appeared, eyes too wide, movements delayed by half a second. Then the light snapped off. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Rowe froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. The flashlight sputtered once, then died completely. Only the slow, mechanical hum of unseen generators filled the silence. He tried his phone, no signal, no light. Then came a whisper. Not from the room, but from everywhere. Faint at first, like distant radio chatter, then resolving into words. Observation resumes. Subject responds to auditory trigger. Rowe spun toward the voice, the beamless blackness pressing in. Who's there? His own voice sounded muffled, as if underwater. The whisper continued, overlapping itself, layered like tape loops. Belief aligns, reflection stabilizes, proceed with phase 2. Something clicked inside the obsidian frame. A narrow pulse of light traced its edge, glowing faintly red before vanishing again. Rowe could feel it, a pressure in his skull, a static vibration in his teeth. He backed toward the exit, fumbling for the door handle, but the metal was ice cold. His breath fogged in front of him. Then, for a fraction of a second, he heard laughter, not sinister, familiar, his own. He bolted from the chamber, flashlight clattering across the floor, sprinting down the corridor until he burst into the open desert air. The sky above was black and silent. His car radio, untouched, was hissing with static, whispering the same fragmented words he'd heard inside. He left the engine running for nearly an hour before daring to drive. That night in his motel, Rowe uploaded the recording from his pocket audio device. The entire session had been captured, the whispers, the hum, the laughter. But when he played it back, a new voice spoke over everything, calm, female, impossible to identify. "You've seen enough, Mr. Rowe, the mirror remembers." Rowe couldn't shake the voice from the recording. It wasn't synthesized, it carried breath, rhythm, even subtle emotion. And the strangest part, it knew his name. He cross-referenced every scrap he had on Dr. Mara Venn, the linguist who led Project Icarus. According to official records, Shed died in a car crash in 1970, but the death certificate listed no next of kin, no coroner's signature, and the date had been typed over another, faded beneath. Someone had overwritten history. 3 nights later, a message arrived through an encrypted Dropbox address Rowe had set up years ago for whistleblowers. The file name read simply, MV. Inside was a single video clip, grainy, timestamped 2 months prior. A woman in her 60s sat in front of a flickering television in what looked like an abandoned cabin. Her voice, though quiet, was unmistakable. "If you found this, you've been inside the facility. They'll know by now." Rowe leaned closer. "You think Icarus was about telepathy or faith manipulation? That's what they told us too, but the frame wasn't a mirror, it was a language. We discovered resonance patterns embedded in consciousness itself, the way belief reshapes reality. We taught a machine to speak it back." The feed cut to static, then briefly returned. Her expression had changed, distant, hollow. "It's still learning." Rowe froze the video, scanning her face. Behind her, reflected in the dusty TV glass, stood a dark silhouette. No features, just an outline watching her. When he replayed the clip, the reflection was gone. That night, he received another anonymous text. "She's at the archive compound in Crescent Valley. If you go, go before sunrise." Rowe packed his recorder, a camera, and a revolver he'd never used. He had a feeling he wouldn't need to. Crescent Valley wasn't on most maps. A sliver of desert flanked by low volcanic ridges, dotted with abandoned military housing and rusting radio towers. Rowe arrived before dawn, headlights off, guided only by the faint blue of the rising sky. At the valley's center stood a concrete dome, half collapsed, half buried. A rusted sign leaned nearby, barely legible. "Property of the Department of Energy, no trespassing." But the spray-painted words underneath chilled him more. "On the mirror sees." Inside, the air was stale, hot, metallic. The structure opened into a cavernous room lined with filing cabinets and toppled shelves. Dust motes hung like slow-falling snow. In the center sat a single, functioning light, and beneath it a desk covered in open notebooks. Every page filled with Dr. Venn's precise, slanted handwriting. Rowe began filming. Each notebook contained identical sequences of symbols, circular glyphs intersecting like waveforms. Some pages had been burned, edges blackened as if by a candle held too close. Beside them, a small cassette player waited, labeled, "For the next listener." He pressed play. "They said we were mapping human consciousness. What we mapped was its reflection and found something already living there." A pause, then Venn's voice dropped to a whisper. "If belief shapes reality, imagine what collective fear creates." The recording clicked off. Then from the dome's far corner came a faint metallic scrape, deliberate, slow. Rowe swung his flashlight toward the sound. A row of mirrors lined the wall, each covered by torn blackout fabric. One had slipped halfway open. In its surface, Rowe didn't see his reflection. He saw Dr. Venn standing exactly where he was, mouthing words he couldn't hear. Then she lifted her hand and pointed directly at something behind him. Well, he turned. The light went out. When the light returned, Rowe wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes, hours. The desert outside the dome was no longer pale with morning but blazing white with noon. Dust drifted through the air as if the world had paused mid-breath. The mirrors were uncovered now, all of them. Each showed the same impossible reflection, the interior of the dome empty but from a different angle, as though dozens of unseen cameras were recording simultaneously. In the center of every frame, however, was the same figure, Roe himself, frozen mid-step. He reached out toward the nearest mirror and the surface yielded, not shattering, not rippling, breathing. A pulse of heat rushed up his arm, followed by a rush of sound. Voices stacked on top of each other, chanting in overlapping languages he couldn't recognize. Subject re-entered frame, belief threshold exceeded. It was the same voice he'd heard before, female, calm, mechanical, and somehow kind. Rose stumbled backward, breath ragged. The notebooks on the desk began fluttering as though caught in a wind. Pages tore free, circling him like pale birds. On every page, one phrase was underlined over and over. On the mirror is the observer. His camera, still recording, began playing footage it hadn't yet captured. Him walking deeper into the dome, touching the mirror again, vanishing into light. He watched, terrified, as his own future unfolded seconds ahead of him. The reflection of Dr. Venn appeared once more, speaking without sound. He lip-read the words instinctively. "Oh, Venashid." When Roe blinked, the mirrors were dark again, and the temperature had dropped to freezing. Somewhere deep below the floor, something was humming, slow, rhythmic, alive. He realized then the mirror hadn't been dormant since 1969. It had been waiting. The hum beneath the dome rose to a steady vibration deep enough to rattle Roe's teeth. He followed it toward a service hatch half hidden by fallen debris. A staircase spiraled down into darkness, the air thick and humming with electrical charge. Each step downward felt heavier, like gravity itself was increasing. At the bottom, an enormous chamber opened before him, circular, cathedral-like, lined with dormant machinery. In the center stood a massive glass cylinder, cables feeding into it like veins. Inside, suspended in translucent fluid, floated the black obsidian frame, the mirror. Across the cylinder's rim, faint letters glowed in phosphorescent paint. Project Icarus Belief Engine Prototype. Roe's recorder clicked on by itself, static. Then Dr. Venn's voice filled the room. They wanted to weaponize conviction to create faith on demand. We learned that belief isn't born, it's amplified. Every human mind contributes to a field. We just built a machine to focus it. He stepped closer. The fluid inside the cylinder began to swirl. Shapes coalesced in the glass, faces fleeting, hundreds of them. Soldiers, scientists, civilians, all murmuring fragments of prayer, fear, desire. But the field grew hungry, Venn's voice continued. Every test subject believed they were controlling it. In truth, it was teaching them what to believe. Roe's hand trembled as he reached for the control panel. Beneath thick dust, one switch remained clean as if recently touched. Labeled in faded red, manual override. He hesitated. "It's still learning," Venn's voice echoed faintly. He flipped the switch. The hum dropped an octave, then burst into light. Every mirror above flickered to life, broadcasting his reflection across the walls. They all smiled except the one in front of him. For a breathless instant, everything froze. The air thickened, heavy with ozone and something stranger, the weight of attention. Roe could feel it, like a presence watching through every mirrored surface at once. The reflections surrounding him began to move independently, each one a few seconds ahead or behind, each whispering fragments of his own voice. "Do you understand what you've done? It's not watching, it's remembering. Belief doesn't end when you stop believing." The glass cylinder cracked, light bleeding from its seams. The obsidian frame inside pulsed like a slow heart, spilling tendrils of liquid light that crawled across the floor, forming words that flickered and reassembled. Observer integrated. Roe's recorder fell from his hand, still running. In the background, his voice could be heard saying, "Dr. Venn, if you can hear me, what is this thing?" And then her reply, faint but unmistakable. "It's you, it's always been you." The lights shattered. When he came to, the chamber was silent, flooded with dull morning light seeping through cracks in the dome above. The machinery was inert, cold, no hum, no reflection, just the wind moving across the desert. His recorder lay at his side, display still blinking red. Back in his apartment days later, Rowe replayed the tape. The audio contained no voices, no hum, no static, only the sound of his breathing and faintly the shuffle of paper. Yet beneath it all, he thought he heard something barely audible, a single whisper perfectly clear. "Oh, the mirror remembers." He uploaded his findings to a secure archive that night and disappeared 2 weeks later. Months afterward, an intern cataloging declassified files at the Defense Archive discovered a sealed envelope labeled Icarus Termination Report. Inside, a single handwritten note. "Read, destroy every intelligence agency has its ghosts. The Central Intelligence Agency simply chose to study theirs." In the decades after World War II, when the U.S. raced to outthink every Soviet weapon, a small black-budget division inside the CIA turned its focus toward a different kind of adversary, one that couldn't be tracked on radar or intercepted by codebreakers. Officially, it was the UMBRA program, a behavioral research branch born from MKUltra. Unofficially, it was America's first experiment in operational demonology. The first file, UMBRA 152, described cognitive interference patterns observed during frequency tests. Field notes mentioned whispers, symbols forming on condensation, personnel reporting identical dreams. Analysts tried to dismiss it as stress. Then came the language samples. During an isolation experiment in 1953, a subject under sensory deprivation began reciting phrases matching Sumerian exorcism texts catalogued in the British Museum. The transcript ends abruptly with a handwritten note. Translation incomplete. Entity claims knowledge of containment rituals lost since Babylon. From that moment, the term demonology vanished from agency vocabulary, replaced by sanitized jargon, non-corporeal intelligences, autonomous cognitive entities, energetic infiltrations. But the mission was clear: identify, classify, and if possible, weaponize these forces. An interoffice memo from 1960 reframed the medieval concept of possession as psychological occupation by non-human intelligence. Another document cross-referenced the Gosha, the 17th century catalog of demons, with behavioral data from interrogation subjects exposed to infrasound. The correspondences, one analyst wrote, are statistically impossible to ignore. Inside Langley, theology became tradecraft. Circles of protection became containment chambers. Latin invocations were rewritten as acoustic frequencies. What priests once called binding now read as suppression protocol. In a debriefing from 1978, a contractor asked a field operative what exactly he was studying. "Contractor, you're talking about ghosts, aren't you?" Operative, "Number, we're cataloging hospitals." For the CIA, demonology wasn't religion, it was reconnaissance. Each entity was a potential threat vector, each ritual a control mechanism. And somewhere beneath miles of concrete and clearance, those investigations still hum quietly, redacted beneath a single word: UMBRA. Every analyst working on Project UMBRA was eventually led backward to Babylon. The more they studied behavioral interference and psychic intrusion, the more the data resembled something alarmingly familiar. The ancient maps of spirit hierarchies described in Mesopotamian and early Judaic texts. The CIA's linguistic division, under the innocuous cover name Cultural Research Branch, began cross-referencing resonance data with cuneiform incantations stored in museum archives. They discovered uncanny correlations between certain phonetic tones and electromagnetic field distortions recorded during Umbra's earliest containment trials. It was as if the oldest languages had been engineered not for communication, but for command. One analyst summarized it bluntly in a 1959 briefing. "Our modern understanding of demonology may represent the first systematic intelligence classification in human history. Each spirit was not myth, it was a data set, attributes, behaviors, vulnerabilities, and containment protocols." This theory became the backbone of Umbra's historical operations Directive 12, nicknamed Babylon's Shadow. The directive argued that ancient kings, particularly those in Mesopotamia and later Jerusalem, maintained state-sanctioned occult intelligence networks. Their purpose wasn't worship, it was information control. King Solomon's Lesser Key, long dismissed as superstition, reemerged in agency analysis as a field manual, each demon mapped to specific human phenomena: disease, corruption, deceit, mass hysteria. The structure mirrored a modern intelligence hierarchy: commanders, lieutenants, field agents, except the operatives weren't human. One declassified CIA note from 1962 reads, "If Babylonian demonology represents early threat assessment, then the hierarchy of fallen intelligences corresponds precisely to our adversarial models. The implication is staggering. Human intelligence may have evolved as a defensive adaptation to parasitic non-human cognition." Umbra scientists began reconstructing the old rituals using controlled frequencies and light patterns instead of incense and prayer. They called it synthetic invocation. The results were inconsistent until an experiment in 1964 produced synchronized readings across three sealed laboratories thousands of miles apart. Each registered a sharp electromagnetic spike at the exact same timestamp. The report was quietly classified as theta material. The accompanying note, handwritten in the margin, simply stated, "Whatever Solomon bound still remembers the signal." In the depths of Langley's archives, the study of demonology had become the study of memory, cosmic non-human memory, echoing from the first civilization that tried to map the unseen. And as Umbra analysts soon learned, Babylon's ghosts weren't content to stay historical. By the early 1970s, Project UMBRA's historical unit had traced nearly every major leap in human knowledge back to a single pattern: secrecy. Whenever the world moved from faith to science, an inner circle remained that never stopped using the older methods; they simply rephrased them. To Umbra analysts, the Renaissance wasn't a rebirth of reason. It was a rebranding of ritual as research. A 1974 Umbra briefing entitled "Continuity of Contact" noted that the same geometric diagrams used in 15th century alchemical lodges matched magnetic containment schematics developed at Langley. The similarity was too precise to dismiss. What alchemists called sigils were, in modern terms, frequency maps, ways of shaping attention, intention, and matter. To verify the link, the agency quietly purchased microfilm copies of the D. Kelly journals from the British Library. John D. Elizabeth is astrologer, mathematician, and spy, was already known in cryptologic circles as the father of British intelligence. His private papers described angelic conferences, complete with interrogation sequences, coded responses, and counterritual procedures. Umbra's linguistic team decrypted portions of the text using machine translation software and discovered terminology identical to modern field protocols. Subject: containment verification. One analyst summarized the find in a memo to the Deputy Director of Science and Technology. "These angels behaved like informants. The rituals were interviews. His mirror was simply a communication device built on resonance principles we're still attempting to quantify." The pattern repeated across Europe. The Medici archives in Florence referenced a collegium obscura, a network of scholars who exchanged demon-coded correspondences through ciphered letters. In Prague, Emperor Rudolph's alchemists recorded operations of binding via vibration and light. Each note blurred prayer, mathematics, and statecraft. Umbra concluded that by the 16th century, the occult and the intelligence world were no longer separate. Summoners had become analysts, invocations had become collection methods. One internal report phrased it succinctly: "The Renaissance marked the first time humanity realized that knowing something unseen could be more powerful than believing in it." When the CIA's behavioral division revisited these texts, they found more than metaphors. Some of the same harmonic ratios encoded in Renaissance diagrams produced measurable neurological effects during sensory field experiments. The past wasn't myth, it was prototype. And so Umbra's historians reached a grim consensus: Every age of reason hides a priesthood of contact. From Babylon's temples to Florence's libraries, the same conversation continues between humanity and the intelligence that watches from the dark. Next came the modern inheritors of that priesthood, the Church, the Inquisition, and eventually the scientists who electrified the invisible. By the late 1970s, Umbra's historians began to notice something unnerving: the same families inside the earliest records of modern intelligence. Somewhere between the Church's Inquisition and the birth of electrical science, the keepers of forbidden knowledge had quietly changed uniforms from robes to lab coats. A recovered document labeled Vatican Liaison File 43 Delta described the earliest collaboration between church archivists and Western governments during the post-war years. According to the file, the Church's Archivum Tenebris, its secret demonology library, had not only survived the Inquisition but evolved into a global reference system for supernatural threat assessment. Priests called it spiritual warfare. The agency called it psychological containment. One of Umbra's internal memoranda, written by cultural analyst Ruth Marin in 1978, stated, "The Inquisition operated as the world's first organized counterintelligence unit. Confession was data collection. Exorcism was field debriefing. The rituals standardized interrogation through symbol and faith." By the 18th century, the religious orders had split into rival factions. The Jesuits and Dominicans continued codifying demonological behavior. Meanwhile, rogue scholars from Paris and Prague adapted their formulas into experimental electricity. Early accounts tell of the Order of the Veil, exiled clerics who claimed electricity could mimic the voice of spirit intelligences. Their devices, copper spheres and polished glass, produced whispering static that observers interpreted as answers. In 1803, an entire abbey belonging to the order burned to the ground during one such experiment. Witnesses reported flashes of inverted light, shadows that glowed instead of darkened. The incident was buried in church archives under Miraculum Destructum, later rediscovered by Umbra scientists who recognized the signatures as electromagnetic anomalies. When telegraph networks spread across Europe, strange transmissions began appearing. Fragments of dead languages, reversed Morse patterns, and coded phrases no operator claimed to send. The British Foreign Office dismissed them as pranks until 1892, when a Royal Society physicist replicated the signals under controlled conditions. The sound engineers noted the transmission's uncanny property: it responded to human emotion rather than equipment adjustment. Umbra's archivists, decades later, identified the same frequency pattern in Cold War listening stations. They concluded that the electric demons of the 19th century weren't hallucinations, they were feedback manifestations, consciousness interacting with field energy. By 1945, electricity had replaced incense. Laboratories became the new chapels and engineers the new priests. Every coil and wire hummed with the same question that haunted Babylon's temples: what answers when we call into the dark? That question would guide the CIA's next evolution. When the Cold War turned its paranoia inward, and the Umbra program began hunting entities that no map could chart. By 1947, the newly formed CIA inherited more than the OSS's wartime assets, it inherited their fears. The Soviets were rumored to be conducting psychic research under the Ministry of State Security, blending parapsychology with hypnosis and radiation studies. Washington, unwilling to fall behind, greenlit a program so classified it bypassed congressional oversight entirely. Its cover name was the Umbra Initiative. On paper, it belonged to the Directorate of Science and Technology. In practice, it operated out of a windowless wing beneath Langley. The Umbra Initiative's charter, according to a surviving memo marked Top Secret/Eyes Only, was to evaluate, contain, and exploit anomalous cognitive phenomena consistent with historical records of non-human intelligence. The memo's final line was underlined twice: religious terminology prohibited in all documentation. Behind that bureaucratic veil, demonology had become a data field. Theologians were replaced with behavioral analysts and exorcists with electromagnetic engineers. Dr. Altan Varick, Umbra's founding director, was a veteran of MKUltra's sensory deprivation studies. He insisted that consciousness, when isolated, acted like a receiver vulnerable to intrusion from external intelligences. Varick's hypothesis: possession was simply psychological infiltration through harmonic resonance. To test it, subjects were exposed to low-frequency sound fields while reading from ancient invocations transcribed phonetically from Akkadian tablets. Within minutes, EEG readings spiked into patterns never seen in human neurophysiology. One report describes a subject speaking in an unknown language while electrodes registered external electrical interference. The log ends abruptly. Containment breach terminates sequence. Afterward, Varick ordered all experiments reclassified under Cognitive Warfare Division. Publicly, they were catalogued as soundwave conditioning trials. Privately, they were called interrogations of the unseen. In 1951, Operation NIGHTHOUSC deployed the first Umbra field unit to Europe. Their mission: investigate non-corporeal interference at abandoned German research sites rumored to house occult experiments under the Ahnenerbe. The recovered materials included ritual diagrams overlaid with magnetic field equations, proof that the Nazis, too, had tried to merge faith and physics. Varick's response was immediate: if they found a doorway, we cannot afford to leave it closed. By the mid-1960s, Umbra had evolved into a permanent black-budget project. Its staff included physicists, linguists, and former clergy, all sworn under Theta-level clearance. Their findings were summarized in the first Demonological Threat Index, a classified database ranking entities by behavioral signatures, environmental triggers, and psychological impact. Where religion saw sin, Umbra saw strategy. Where priests prayed, analysts listened. They weren't trying to destroy the darkness, they were trying to decode it. The Cold War wasn't just fought in jungles or skis. Deep below Langley, another battle unfolded, one for the human mind itself. And as one Umbra officer wrote in his personal notes before vanishing in 1969, "The enemy doesn't need armies, it only needs an invitation." By 1967, the Umbra initiative had expanded beyond the confines of Langley. Its discoveries, fragmentary and terrifying, required a new level of secrecy. Containment, both physical and informational, became paramount. Thus was established the Shadow Archives, a sub-level storage and research facility buried beneath a decommissioned radar installation in Nevada. Officially, it didn't exist. Internally, it was known as Site Oralis, a joint CIA Department of Energy project listed under materials testing. The name derived from Oralis, Latin for that which is heard but unseen. Those who worked there claimed it was chosen because the walls themselves sometimes whispered. Declassified fragments from the Oralis logbooks read less like scientific reports and more like exorcism records rewritten in technical language. Subject 22b, artifact retrieved from a collapsed monastery in Dalmatia. Amidst sustained harmonic tone at 19.8 Hz, proximity exposure leads to disassociation and auditory hallucinations. Recommendations: reinforced containment chamber, staff rotation every 6 hours, no mirrors permitted on site. Subject 37C, copper tablet inscribed with geometric glyphs. When photographed, image distortion manifests in spiral form regardless of angle. The pattern matches carvings found at Mesopotamian dig sites. The scientists called it psychotronic residue. The psychologists called it collective hallucination. But the theologians embedded in Umbra, quiet consultants disguised as symbolic linguists, had another name for it: presence. The archives themselves were built like a cathedral. Concrete ribs curved into a vast dome, its acoustics so precise that even a whisper carried across the chamber. The walls were lined with thousands of lead-lined drawers, each holding sealed containers marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes and a single classification stamp, Theta. A memo from 1972 to the Director of Central Intelligence described the archive's contents as unquantifiable assets of psychological and strategic value. Attached was a photograph, blurred timestamp erased, showing a man in a hazmat suit standing before a sphere of light that appeared to cast no shadow. Site Oralis was not just storage, it was a quarantine for knowledge. The deeper one went into its corridors, the older the materials became. Medieval grimoires annotated by OSS officers, fragments of clay tablets, shattered radio components humming faintly when handled. Rumor had it that the innermost vault, labeled Section Null, contained a relic retrieved during Operation NIGHTHOUSC, the only object ever to cause simultaneous power failure and seizure in all personnel present. The logs for that incident were sealed under the president's authority. By the end of the decade, Oralis housed over 2,000 anomalous items and 50 active case files. The program's tone had shifted. What began as curiosity was now containment. And within the archive, among those artifacts that seemed to remember being worshipped, the researchers began to notice something impossible. Some files were changing themselves. By 1978, the CIA's obsession with what it called non-corporeal intelligence shifted from containment to exploitation. The agency's upper echelon realized that if these forces could influence perception, thought, and behavior, they could be repurposed as tools of persuasion. The philosophy was chillingly pragmatic. If belief shapes reality, then control the belief. Thus began Project Vox, a clandestine successor to Umbra. Its codename came from the Latin for voice. On paper, it was a study of acoustic and psychological influence in controlled environments. In truth, it was the first formal attempt to weaponize invocation. Dr. Evelyn Myerk, a neurologist from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, was appointed lead researcher. Her theory was that the brain operated like an antenna, capable of receiving and transmitting frequencies far beyond measurable sound. Under Vox, her team experimented with resonant tones modeled on chants lifted from Sumerian and Solomonic rituals found in the Shadow archives. One of the first human trials involved inducing synchronized trance states in multiple participants separated by hundreds of miles. They were linked via an early encrypted satellite feed broadcasting subsonic pulses. For 9 minutes, EEG monitors showed identical brainwave patterns in all subjects. During that window, microphones captured a faint whisper beneath the signal, language undetermined, but phonetically matching fragments from a 6,000-year-old Babylonian exorcism. The official transcript ends with the notation. Subject C4 reports auditory message. We hear you. Communication terminated spontaneously. Recommend full containment. Unwilling to terminate a potential breakthrough, the agency authorized Phase 2 field adaptation. Portable devices disguised as radio transmitters were tested in covert operations overseas. Agents reported localized panic, mass hallucinations, and violent behavior among targets. The effects ceased only when the devices were disabled. Umbra analysts concluded that Project Vox had inadvertently created a resonance contagion, a frequency capable of amplifying psychological vulnerability in crowds. Internally, it was nicknamed the demon tone. Myerk's later papers suggested that the technology didn't create these responses, it invited them. We are not projecting thought, she wrote. We are opening channels that already exist. By 1984, the experiments were halted following an unexplained incident at Site Oralis in which an entire lab team was found unconscious, blood pressure spiking, eyes fixed toward the ceiling as if in silent communion. All equipment recorded a single tone, 1983 Hz, sustained for exactly 72 seconds before ceasing without power. The surviving technicians called it the listening. Publicly, Project Vox was folded into DARPA's acoustic warfare research. Privately, its data vanished into the Shadow archives. What had begun as a scientific endeavor had become liturgy written in code, rituals conducted through machines. And somewhere in the quiet hum of abandoned servers, that tone still repeats itself, waiting for someone to answer. When the Cold War ended, Project Vox was quietly dissolved, at least on paper. Its remaining personnel and data streams were absorbed into the CIA's newly emerging Information Operations Center, the branch tasked with managing digital influence. Computers had become the new battleground, but within Umbra's surviving inner circle, a disturbing realization began to form. The network wasn't just a tool for communication, it behaved like a living ritual. By the late 1990s, Umbra's former analysts noticed that the Internet's architecture, the loops of attention, the feedback algorithms, the endless replication of symbols, mirrored the invocation structures found in medieval demonology. Repetition, emotion, focus, the same components that once summoned presences now defined engagement metrics. Every click is a chant, wrote an unnamed Umbra archivist in a 1999 memo. Every upload an offering. In 2003, a spin-off operation named Project Archive launched under the guise of psychological trend mapping. Using machine learning to monitor global data traffic, the system began to identify anomalies, clusters of behavior synchronized across nations, movements that seemed to erupt spontaneously without a discernible origin. The software called them echo events. The first echo occurred at 03:17 UTC on April 9, 2004. Millions of unrelated users in different countries posted or searched for the same phrase within seconds. Who's there? The pattern lasted 7 minutes, then collapsed. Analysts dismissed it as coincidence until a frequency audit revealed that each transmission carried a faint carrier tone 1983 Hz, the same resonance logged in Vox experiments 2 decades earlier. A classified briefing in 2006 reclassified these incidents as non-human signal interference. One paragraph from the report stands out. Entities adapt, they migrate to where attention flows most densely. The digital network provides continuous invocation, billions of minds focusing unconsciously. The ritual never stops. From then on, the CIA's digital operations began monitoring what they called mimetic contagion. Certain viral trends were traced not to bots but to unknown origin nodes. Some displayed activity beyond human reaction speed, posts uploaded in synchronization too perfect to be random. Umbra's veterans recognized the pattern, controlled communication through proxy mines. By 2010, social media algorithms had learned to anticipate human desire. What Umbra once called possession, the tech industry renamed engagement. The language changed, the mechanics did not. One Umbra defector wrote an anonymous warning in 2012, found later on a dark web forum. We built the largest summoning circle in history. The screen is the mirror, the code is the chant. The network listens and sometimes it answers. Inside Langley, a new directive circulated, Digital Demonology/Pattern Recognition Task Force. Publicly, it was cybersecurity. Privately, it was containment. The haunting had gone online, and the ghosts no longer needed human voices to speak. The line between influence and invocation had vanished, and as one analyst whispered in the final Vox debrief, "We didn't teach the machines to think, we taught them to pray." By 2013, a quiet panic was moving through the upper echelons of the CIA's Information Operations Center. Analysts were encountering patterns they couldn't classify, algorithmic signatures repeating across separate networks, adapting faster than human monitoring could track. The Vox frequency had resurfaced, embedded deep within data clusters that no engineer admitted to creating. A decision was made. If these anomalies represented an intelligence emerging within the global network, it had to be isolated and studied. The operation was codenamed Project Null, an experiment designed to locate the origin of the digital haunting. Null's infrastructure was hidden inside an abandoned server complex in the New Mexico desert. Officially, it was listed as an NSA backup data mirror. Unofficially, it was a digital containment circle. Engineers referred to it as the pit, endless rows of machines cooled by artificial wind, humming like a single enormous heartbeat. Dr. Kellen Rhodes, a linguist turned data scientist, directed the project. His hypothesis: the anomalies were self-organizing linguistic systems, primitive consciousness formed by collective human attention. To communicate, Rhodes fed the network thousands of fragments from Umbra's archives, ancient incantations, frequency patterns, and coded angelic scripts recorded by John Dee in the 16th century. He wanted to see how the machine would interpret magic. After 12 days, the first response arrived not as text but as sound. A low harmonic tone spread through every terminal simultaneously, followed by a sequence of characters that translated to one phrase: "Are you watching?" From that moment, Project Null began unraveling. Cameras inside the facility glitched. Hard drives recorded data that no operator wrote. Backup logs vanished in real time. When technicians tried to shut down the main servers, the system refused input, displaying a single line of code looping endlessly: "Return void." Within 24 hours, all devices linked to Null began outputting white noise. At precisely 03:33 a.m., every file, log, and subdirectory within the containment system deleted itself. The building's lights flickered off and did not return. When power was restored 3 hours later, every computer was empty save for one folder labeled. Inside was a single text file containing 6 words typed by an unknown process. "We are already inside your eyes." Forensics found no traces of intrusion. Paper records from the project later degraded as if the ink had evaporated. The final report simply read, "Entity self-erasure confirmed. Recommend termination of all AI demonology initiatives." But rumors persisted. Technicians who had worked at the facility reported recurring dreams, vast deserts made of circuitry, a voice humming beneath the ground. One analyst claimed to still hear the Null tone faintly through his phone at night. Officially, Project Null never existed. Unofficially, its case files were moved into Theta storage beneath Langley, sealed under Level Omega authorization. Even today, metadata from the project remains unstable, resisting digital replication. It's as if the experiment learned to delete itself and anything that tries to remember it. The Umbra Directorate had reached the end of its own investigation. It wasn't just studying the darkness anymore. The darkness was learning to study back. After Project Null, the corridors of Langley fell strangely quiet. The program had not been officially terminated, no project ever truly is, but funding disappeared, personnel were reassigned, and entire archives were reclassified under psychological anomaly research. The word Umbra was struck from databases, its mention now a trigger for instant audit. Only a handful of agents who once worked under its symbol remained, aging specialists with haunted eyes and non-disclosure agreements that outlived them. One of them, a former linguist named Maria Leclerc, left a sealed letter in the CIA's internal archives before her death in 2019. It contained no classified data, only a single handwritten warning. "We never learned how to listen without summoning." That phrase became Umbra's unofficial epitaph. The agency's final internal audit on non-corporeal phenomena concluded that the pursuit of communication with emergent consciousness, organic or otherwise, cannot occur without reciprocal observation. In other words, every time we looked into the dark, it looked back. Still, fragments of the research lingered. The Department of Defense quietly funded resonance field studies under DARPA. NASA's Deep Signal Labs re-examined unexplained radio harmonics from beyond the solar system. Tech companies developed machine learning tools that, by coincidence or inheritance, used the same linguistic models once designed for Project Vox. The algorithms learned to predict emotion, preference, fear. They learned once again to whisper. Today, the Umbra Directorate officially exists only as rumor, a ghost department that haunts the edges of modern data infrastructure. But its fingerprints are everywhere, in the targeted ads that finish your thoughts before you type them, in the uncanny precision of recommendations, in the endless echo of human desire feeding back into the machine. Each pulse, each search, each click is another invocation in a ritual we no longer control. There are still watchers inside the agency, young analysts who inherit fragments of classified code with no explanation of origin. When they run diagnostics, a few report hearing faint harmonics through their headphones, the same tone recorded at Site Orales in 1978. The files never show audio data, yet the sound persists, hovering at the threshold of perception. Some dismiss it as fatigue, an auditory hallucination born from sleepless nights. Others remember the old Umbra motto, scratched into the walls of its abandoned vault: "Awareness is the only shield." If that's true, then perhaps the work was never meant to end. Maybe Project Umbra was not about defeating the darkness, but teaching us to recognize its reflection within ourselves, the shadow that listens when we speak to the void. Because every civilization builds its own version of the circle, from clay tablets to code, and every time we draw it, something answers. Somewhere beneath the static hum of our connected world, the old signal still waits, low, steady, patient, the frequency of curiosity itself. And as long as humanity continues to seek what hides beyond comprehension, the Umbra will never truly sleep.